Hello, everybody. My name is Catherine Peerson, and I will be presenting my Keystone Affective Possibilities and Narratives of Climate Disaster. As a student of English and classics for my project, I wanted to look at how contemporary fictional narratives of climate change build upon this tradition of representing the relationship between man and nature in literature, and exploring the possibilities this opens for reckoning with anthropogenic climate change and perhaps inspiring action and activism in the real world. So I wanted to begin by speaking a bit to this history and then talking about what I've actually done for my project. So for all of humanity, people have been experiencing and writing about climate events, whether it be something miraculous, something disastrous, or even apocalypse. We see this in biblical texts like accounts of the flood, mythologies talking about apocalypse. In Nordic mythology, you have Ragnarok, or non-fictional narratives of specific historical catastrophes like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and Pliny's account of that. And authors tended to turn to different schools of thought to make sense of and reckon with these climate events, whether it be the theogenic idea that gods were the cause, the geogenic idea that they're simple natural byproducts of Earth processes, or later in science fiction, the xenogenic school of thought, which is that extraterrestrial beings are responsible. But all of these events were singular, isolated climate events. They weren't part of a trend, which is now what we're seeing since the Industrial Revolution with anthropogenic climate change. And this has really pushed the limits of our understanding in the sense that it shattered our perception of what the world is and what the Earth is as a stable entity. And so in the 21st century, as the science behind this idea has been accepted and talked about in the media much more, authors have started writing about anthropogenic climate change specifically and created a new space to reckon with these ideas. So for my project, I decided to do case studies of 4 novels from 4 distinct genres within the broader categorization of climate fiction, which is a term I'm using very loosely just to denote novels that in some way reckon with the idea of climate or the natural environment. So I decided to look at Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver as a more traditional realist narrative, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a dystopian and post-apocalyptic text, Weather by Jenny Offel, which is, it tends more towards the realist in the narrative, but the structure of the novel is quite experimental. And finally, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is a high fantasy science fiction speculative text. And I'll only have time to talk about 2 of these books today, but they're quite different. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the scope of my project. So Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver is set in southern Appalachia in a poor rural farming community, and a lot of the characters don't believe in climate change. They don't have access to really media or the internet, and so their experience and their ideas about this are based on just what's happening in their own lives, and that doesn't involve climate change until it literally shows up in their backyards. And with this idea, you see the importance of narrative really drawn out. The main character, Delarobia, often refers to either biblical texts or even her high school English class, not only the text there, but the themes that emerge of man versus nature. So this is a picture of monarch butterflies overwintering in Mexico, which is something that happens annually as part of their migration. And the premise of Flight Behavior is that this happens one year in southern Appalachia as opposed to Mexico, which is obviously quite a distance. And this is something that has never before been seen by these characters. And so as Delarobia sees this, she says, no words came to her that seemed sane. Trees turned to fire, a burning bush. Moses came to mind, and Ezekiel, words from scriptures that occupied a certain space in her brain, etc. So here you see Delarobia coming up against this limit of her understanding and of her idea of what reality is. And to understand this and to make sense of it, she turns to biblical texts. And just to give a different image of this so you can kind of see what Delarobia is seeing, this is an aerial view of the same phenomenon. And something that I think is important to mention here is that when this text was published in 2017, the monarch butterflies were still overwintering in Mexico. And this idea that, you know, is the basis of this narrative was completely fictional. And since then, the butterflies have actually moved not all the way to Southern Appalachia, but they have moved more north. And so you see here this sort of ontological unease of these texts which border the fictional and the non-fictional. I next wanted to talk about The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which doesn't just look at a changed world, but as a completely destroyed world. And this idea is followed through in the text itself. It really engages with this paradox of the post-apocalyptic, the idea that once the world has ended, there really can't be any sort of narrative. There can't be anything because the world has ended. However, what McCarthy does in this text is that he shores it up with this rich body of allusions to Beowulf, the Fairy Queen, the Bible, classical antiquity, all of these texts which speak to a perseverance of literary tradition and hope through this narrative. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to talk about two quotes. This first one is in The Road. He writes, "The ashes of the late world carried on the bleak and temporal winds to and fro in the void, carried forth and scattered and carried forth again, sustained by a breath trembling and brief." So this is a very desolate image. Not a lot of hope here, you would think, but when you compare this to a poem by Shelley, who uses a lot of the same imagery, I won't read it all out here, but there's ashes, just like in McCarthy, except here they're from an unextinguished hearth, speaking to the fact that his narrative and his words will live on even when he does not, and even when the rest of the world has changed to become dead or withered. So here you see that this very bleak narrative in McCarthy actually does, through this self-reflexive assertion of narrative, can engender hope. So looking at where we go from here and what this all means, I wanted to highlight these two ideas that come across in all of the texts that I've analyzed. Each one constructs and deconstructs worlds to allow a reimagining of humanity's relationship to the land that can be based upon ethics and care rather than any sort of capitalist idea of natural resources. They also assert narrative as an act of hope. So in this self-reflexive way, engaging with previous texts and previous narratives to put forth hope. And it's difficult to quantitatively assess the effects of literature, but some texts clearly have had an impact on public policy or individual activism. And in my research, it's become clear that literature offers invaluable possibilities to construct a new understanding of how we relate to our changing world as climate change continues, so as to inspire not only activism and care towards the land, but also hope. So that is all I have. And I'll stop sharing. Thank you.